Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, James. A great thanks to the two wonderful organizations that have come together to put this on, and to our good friends, Jean Doyen de Montaigu and Mr. Kovner, who are our hosts and sponsors. Thank you very much. And most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. I know that you all have very busy, full lives. It's a beautiful evening here, and you had lots of options to do with your time, and yet you've given it to me for an hour, and I'm extremely grateful for that. The only way I know how to adequately try to express that gratitude is to try to make the next period as entertaining as possible, as informative as possible, and as authentic as possible. In order to find out what Palm Beach was like when Addison Mizner arrived there just during the First World War, let me go back in time a little bit and talk about the very beginnings, which is when the ship, the Providencia, came ashore on its way from Cuba back to Spain, carrying 20,000 coconuts. And it came ashore right where, many years later, Marjorie Merriweather Post built Mar-a-Lago. The local natives found this crop, they thought. Oh, they thought, well, wonderful, we'll plant them and we'll have something to eat. They didn't know what it was. And because of the climatic conditions, these seeds grew into beautiful coconut palms very quickly, ergo the name Palm Beach. As you probably know, Palm Beach sits on the knuckle of the peninsula of Florida. It's the most easternmost point in Florida, and it is the closest to the Gulf Stream and enjoys the best climate in southern Florida. But nothing happened there after the Providencia came ashore until this man, Henry Morrison Flagler, extended his Florida East Coast Railroad, the last outpost having been St. Augustine, the next one West Palm Beach, before he went on to Key West. And when he was in West Palm Beach, he built this little wooden bridge across the Intercoastal, which is now the North Bridge. It was just a railroad crossing. And he came there, and in the words of J.P. Morgan, he had the genius to see what Florida's wilderness of sand and underbrush was capable of becoming, and the nerve to build a railroad to get there. Flagler had he was dating who would become his third wife, Mary Lily Keenan, 40 years his junior. And she came down, and as a wedding gift to her, he built the wonderful Whitehall. Whitehall, by the way, in Mizner's words, was just another southern mansion. Mizner felt that it had nothing to do with it had not been adapted to our climate there. It was a transplant from a southern mansion style, and he was determined that if he was going to build anything, it would certainly be adapted to the climate and have windows on 3 sides of the main rooms and great vegetation. No sooner had he gotten Whitehall up, he started to build the Royal Poinciana Hotel. And the Royal Poinciana Hotel, once it was finished, had 1,060 rooms. It was the largest wooden structure in the world. If you put all of those wings together, it was almost a half a mile in length. And just to give you an idea of it, I'm going to expand on that one little area that you're now looking at to see how beautiful this 6-story building was. One of the important things about the fact that now Palm Beach had that magnificent hotel in Whitehall is that they both had ballrooms. And that was the only place that society could gather, was in the 2 ballrooms of the house or of the hotel. And there was nothing else. There were no big homes. There were little cottages and little bungalows starting to pop up. But at this point in time, there's still no large homes. So I'm going to show you an aerial view now of Palm Beach, starting with the north end, where you see Whitehall was here, and the Royal Poinciana next to it, and then that's the breakers. You see the middle bridge, the in-town area. Worth Avenue is right along here, the Everglades Club back in there. And this area is called the estate section, and it goes down to where Mar-a-Lago is, and beyond that is called Billionaires Row. So, let's talk about Addison Mizner. That's what you're here to hear about. Who was Addison Mizner? We're going to talk a little bit about his background. It's very unusual. I think you will agree. We talk about the people who influenced him, good and bad. This was an amazing man. He differed from everybody else and certainly differed from all the great architects. We'll talk about his clients, why they fell in love with him, how he worked with them. We'll talk about his work in Palm Beach and in Boca Raton, the failed city of Boca Raton at the time. And then we'll talk about his death, a very unusual type of death. We would think that he had probably risen to great wealth and great fame. He died intestate, impoverished, and with no clients. So this amazing, enigmatic man had very little written about him, really. Raymond Vickers said of him that he was the most flamboyant promoter in paradise. It's true. We have George Tyndale, another biographer, who said that he was one of the greatest charlatan geniuses of the 20s. Also true. I like to call him a bon vivant. He was a humanist and an animal lover. We see him here with Johnny Brown, his pet spider monkey on his shoulder, and one of his parrots. And he paraded around Palm Beach visiting his clients with his pets. He was a quintessential charmer. Don't think that these titans of American industry and society gathered around him and begged him to do their houses if he was a crashing bore. He differed from the architects of the period, who were very stuffy, and they had very formal meetings, and Mizner would do things very differently. He was, by definition, the inventor of the Mediterranean Revival, or the Med-Rev architectural style. Now, we all know that as you go around the Mediterranean, there's a bunch of different styles, of course, from Spain to France to Italy and around to North Africa, and he managed to incorporate all of these into his design. Somebody who is a lot smarter than I said that architecture, like all art, is a work of fiction, but it has to be believable. And he made his work believable. In a house, Mizner would have all of the elements that I'm going to call, for the time being, ingredients that you see on here. You can't read them, but so I'll highlight a few. He always had wonderful cornice details and entablatures, as we can see in an example here. He used arched windows with decorative columns, as you can see here, in every of houses. He liked balustraded balconies, either over the main door or anywhere else through the building. And all of his houses will have ornamental brackets, some decorative, some structural, as we can see in this example. He was always finished his work with white stucco walls and red tile roofs. You'll often see low-pitched roofs with multiple gables, as in this example. So I referred to these elements as ingredients because I like to liken it to baking a cake. Take a look at this cake. It's simple, it's beautiful, and oh, by the way, it is the wedding cake of Jean de Montaillou and Michael Kovner in 2004. Always using good taste, simplicity, nice elements. And when they came together in a house, for example, La Guérida, the Kennedy compound, you would have a situation like this. And of course, La Guérida made so famous by this iconic picture at the gate, at the front gate of the house. Now, supposing another chef had these same elements, let's say the Swedish chef. What would the Swedish chef do if he had all of the same elements and was to put it into a house? Now, I hope this doesn't belong to any of your relatives, but it looks like the ingredients were put into a blender and just thrown across the building. So Mizner, as we said, had a great sense of humor. One of his very famous quotes is that when there's a will, there's a lawsuit. He had a mentor who was essential in getting Mizner launched, because as we will see, he had a very odd early career. But his patron was Paris Singer, who said that Mizner was too large, too talented, too unique to be bound by straight-laced morality. Frank Lloyd Wright, who was not used to giving compliments to people, said of Mizner that many architects had imagination, but only Addison Mizner had the courage to let it out of the cage. So let's see his family. He was very devoted to his family. He adored his mother, and he respected his father. This is Addison. This is young Addison, and with his siblings. And a couple of you, as you came in, said, but you are going to talk about Wilson, aren't you? Well, that's Wilson. And we will, of course, talk about Wilson. When Mizner was 15, his father was named ambassador to Guatemala. And Mizner said in his memoir that it was the greatest day of my life when he got there because he fell in love with the 17th and 18th century imitations of Spanish styles that were in Guatemala at the time. Instead of doing sports with other children of his age, he delved into studying these buildings. And you will see the elements that he discovered and that he fell in love with and throughout all of his work in later years, some of the buildings that he liked in Guatemala. So he started off a very disparate career the right way. He went to work for this gentleman in San Francisco, Willis Jefferson Polk, who taught him a couple of important things, but perhaps the most important thing that Polk taught him was to be a jack of all trades, which he was. Which was very different from the architects, the great architects of that period. They didn't get their hands dirty. Mizner did, and Polk taught him how to do that. But Polk had him designing California bungalows, and Mizner tired of this very quickly. And so Wilson, Mizner, remember him, tells him, let's go make our fortune and go off to discover gold in Alaska, which they did. And of course, we can all imagine how that ended up. They had actually discovered a small field, but Wilson lost it in the card game. And that will be the kind of things that will always happen between these two brothers who had a very interesting symbiotic relationship. They were tied together so tightly, like a strip nut and a strip bolt, both flawed individuals, and they remained extremely loyal to each other. And Mizner will fish him out of trouble over and over again, and Wilson will continue to bankrupt Mizner over and over again, and Mizner never was angry about it. He was completely generous and completely magnanimous about it. So after the experience in Alaska, he decides, I'll go off à l'aventure, I'm going to go around the world, and his first stop was in Hawaii, where he made what he called horrible charcoal drawings. Well, it couldn't have been so horrible. This one's rather sweet, because he earned enough money to stay there for a while and then to continue on where he went to Australia and became an amateur boxer. Mizner was a big man. He had a terrible leg. He was threatened to have it amputated on several occasions during his life. But in spite of his bad leg, he went off and became a boxer in Australia. Finally, luckily for him, in 1901, he ends up in New York, where he meets the great Sanford White. We see Sanford White here with his two partners. At the time, White was designing a beautiful rose cliff in Newport in the French Baroque Revival style. And Mizner didn't work on Rosecliff, but Mizner was with White a lot during the design phases. And he said of White, I worshipped him. For me, he was my God. Now, we've spoken about Wilson a couple of times. Who was Wilson? He was a rogue. He was charming. He had a sense of humor. Women flocked to him. And many of them ended up suing him because he stole from them over and over again. In fact, he stole from a lot of things. He was a playwright of some success early on. One of his great lines was that if you steal from one author, it's plagiarism, but if you steal from many, it's research. So Mizner had come to Florida and had left Wilson behind in New York. And Wilson got involved in a bad drug deal, and he was beaten up very badly to within an inch of his life. And he called Mizner, who was setting up in Florida, and he said what had happened. And Mizner said to him, but who hit you? And he said, well, I think it was St. Patrick's Cathedral. And so he said, well, look, you come on down here and we'll set you up. And when he gets off the train and he sees all of these wealthy widows and women, he says, oh, Florida was invented for Addison Mizner's little brother. The relationship between the two is so interesting that Sondheim wrote two plays, Bounce and Roadshow. They're not great plays. They were certainly not his famous plays. But they do really describe the odd and interesting relationship that these two men had. Now, fortunately, offsetting the bad influence that Wilson was, enter Paris Singer, the 23rd child of Isaac Singer, Not the inventor of the sewing machine, which we all think, but he was the one who basically took it and marketed it and made it into a huge success. But because of the marriages that he had, the bulk of this vast estate went to his son Paris. And when Mizner met Paris in New York, before they came to Palm Beach, he said that Singer would become the cause of his existence for the next 10 years. At the time, First World War, Paris Singer, like many wealthy Americans, and Europeans for that matter, had turned over his 2 European mansions to become convalescent hospitals for mostly American, but for World War I veterans. The house in Devon had already been converted, and he then converted his house in Saint-Cloud, not too far from Paris, which, by the way, he had given earlier to his mistress, Isadora Duncan, who had her dance studio in that house and was happy to give it back to become a convalescent hospital. They had a child, by the way. They had Patrick, who died tragically at 3 years old in Paris when the driver didn't put a brake on properly and the car rolled into the Seine River and the little boy was drowned. So during the First World War, they arrived, 3 of them, Paris, Addison, and Miss Bates, their nurse, because they were both quite ill at the time. She will become the 3rd Mrs. Singer, the nurse, Miss Bates. They come to Palm Beach, and Paris had a small bungalow on Peruvian Avenue, something similar to one of these. And they decided, they recovered rather quickly, probably because they stopped drinking. Miss Bates said, you've got to clean up your act, and they recovered, and instead of being there to convalesce and to perhaps coast off under a palm tree with a newspaper, they decided they needed to do something. But Mizner looked around, and he said, as I looked around Peruvian Avenue, all I saw were other atrocities similar to the one we were in, and he also noticed that the land had been raped of all of its natural beauty. So they decided, what are we going to do? We need to do something here. And so the 2 of them put their heads together. And one day, Paris comes back to Addison, and he says, I have a great idea. I have found a piece of land. It's just a half a mile from here. I want you to come and see it. And they go and they see this piece of property, and Mizner says, it is so beautiful. It ought to be something religious, with a chapel built out into the lake, with great cool cloisters and a court of oranges, a gate over there on the road where the faithful could leave their offerings and receive largesse. What a spot. And they were looking at this, ladies and gentlemen. They were looking at Joe's Alligator Farm. Now, there wasn't a lot to do in Palm Beach. Joe's Alligator Farm was about one of the few gigs where people were brought from the Royal Ponciana Hotel down the North Lake Trail to see Joe wrestle alligators. And they buy it, or Paris buys it, and says, let's build a wonderful, unique type convalescent hospital here. From Mizner's memoir, we see him say that nowhere could I get tiles, so I built kilns. I had to build a tree-moving machine. What fun it was, teaching men how to stucco and teaching others how to cure pip in chickens. And within 10 months, no exaggeration, within 10 months, the fabulous Everglades Convalescent Hospital was about to open, but the war ended abruptly, and they changed course shortly before the end of the construction, and they made it into a club that Paris Singer would rule with an iron fist. All club members had to resign at the end of every season and reapply during the winter. It was his own personal little fiefdom. And this magnificent structure opens up. It's going to have its 100th anniversary this year. We have some Everglades Club members in the audience. And the dining room as it was then and now, the living room as it was then and now, and he incorporated, of course, the cloisters and all of the other elements that we spoke about. And Paris had a beautiful apartment, which is there now. If you have $250,000 spare dollars for a month and you'd like to rent it next winter, perhaps you might be able to get on a wait list. And so this great party, he had promised Paris that on February 19th of 1919, which was the height of the season, because it was Ned Stotesbury's birthday. And it was the height of the season. He promised him that this club would be built and open that date. And he said that there was going to be a beautiful terrace built out into the lake. And the party was about ready to happen. It was a week away. Things were being prepared. And the terrace hadn't been poured yet. Remember, there was a building boom going on in Miami also, and they just couldn't get the equipment to pour the terrace into the lake until they saw a tugboat pulling some perfect equipment going down the Intercoastal. They raced out, Addison raced out, and he bribed the tugboat driver to break down. They basically confiscated the equipment. They finished the terrace. The terrace was poured. It was just drying at the time of the party. And he had also told Paris that he promised him 10 months earlier that when the party happened, there would be orange trees laden with fruit all around the terrace. Well, he didn't have those. Nothing had been planted. But he bought orange trees in pots. He sent someone out to buy crates of oranges and clothespins. And even so, the lighting was beautiful. Nobody noticed that these orange trees were oranges that were pinned to them with clothespins. Paris was so impressed. He said that Addison is amazing. He paints, carves wood, and works in metals, knows all about making glazed pottery, and his wrought iron is second to none in old Spain. One of the lovely guests who was in the audience here said, but you are going to talk about the fact of what he called the kiss of ages. And see, a lot of his clients, as we will see, went to Europe with him and bought all of these fabulous originals, but some of them didn't. And Mizner would come around and he'd have chains in his pocket and he'd be slamming them against the woodwork and the furniture and the columns. And he did all sorts of other things. He'd pocket knives and he'd scratch up the wood, and he put condensed milk to make the walls look like it had the kiss of the ages. He was a real genius at doing that. Luckily for him that night at the party was Eva Stotesbury, Queen Eva, as he will call her. She was figuratively speaking, the Archduchess of High Society in Palm Beach. Her other home, there were several, but the main one was the Neo-Georgian house by Horace Trumbauer outside of Philadelphia, White Marsh Hall. And Mrs. Stotesbury had hired Trumbauer to build her Palm Beach mansion. But at the opening of the Everglades Club, she said to him, "Oh, Mr. Mizner, if only I could have a home here that would reflect what I'm seeing at the Everglades Club tonight." And she said, "But I can't because I've hired Horace and it's going to take 4 years. He's told me in 4 years he'll have my house." And Mizner said, "But Mrs. Stotesbury, I'll give you your house next winter. And it will reflect what you're seeing here at the Everglades Club." By the way, we see Mrs. Stotesbury with Mrs. Hutton, who is Marjorie Merriweather Post. Hutton was her second husband, as you know, E.F. Hutton. And Mrs. Stotesbury was determined to hand over the baton of the Queen of High Society to Mrs. Hutton. And she did, by the way. She helped her learn and get her feet on the ground about great entertainment. We see her here towards the end of her life. And sure enough, by the next winter, when she came back, El Mirasol, the fabulous, amazing El Mirasol, was built. And we see El Mirasol was exactly what she wanted. It had all of the elements that he had shown her. It had the first indoor swimming pool in Florida. They had a zoo. It was built on a 40-acre tract. You see, Mar-a-Lago had several piers, several rivals. This was one of them. They had a zoo. The Stotesburys were very liberal, very socially liberal people. They would have all of the children of all of the shopkeepers and everybody come to enjoy their zoo. Flash forward, unfortunately, we lost El Mirasol in 1954. When the term white elephant came into play, these families who were either dying off and leaving it to their relatives didn't want to run houses that took 30 servants to operate, houses that by the 50s were going to require modernization with bathrooms and air conditioning. They tried to sell them. They tried to turn them into clubs over and over again. They never succeeded with these three that I'm going to show you. And sadly enough, it was torn down. And the only thing that we see is a back gate to El Mirasol, the ruins of a back gate to El Mirasol, which was not designed by Mizner, but by Facio a few years later. And this is what that site has become. If there's ever a case for preservation, just look at this and a few of the others that I'm going to show you. Now, as soon as the Stotesburys had finished their home, the Phippses, Josh and Margarita Grace Phipps, decided they would like one. And they bought a 40-acre tract just north of El Mirasol. And within a year, they have Casa Benditta, Blessed House. Different in style. You see an Italianate influence here with an indoor-outdoor swimming pool. Beautiful, beautiful ground floors. Now, you see, Mizner begged all of his clients to let him be the interior designer for the ground floors of his houses. He said, I want them to live in these houses on the ground floor the way I would intend them to live. I don't really care what they do upstairs in the bedrooms. So he had never had any touch of what was done, how the bedrooms were designed. Designed, yes, but not furnished. Look at these beautiful furnitures. You might have picked up that Mrs. Phipps's maiden name was Grace, Grace Shipping Line. So what they would do is, Mizner and his clients would all sail over to Europe in the summer in the great liners, and Mrs. Phipps would send over some freighters, and they'd pull off their custom-built Rolls Royces and things in Europe, and they'd drive all around, and they would buy absolutely everything in sight. Everything was for sale. The First World War had just recently happened, and so much of Europe's treasures were available, and this group of people had so much fun driving all over the Mediterranean, buying anything from tiles and pillars and fireplaces and paneling and even down to fabrics. And once a freighter was filled, it would go back to the States, and another freighter would be available to load up with these treasures again. Well, we lost Casa Benditta too, and that's what Casa Benditta is. That's where it was, and that's the 40 acres upon which it sat. Just to the north of Casa Benditta, Josh and Eleanor Cosden built their magnificent home. It is thought that he might have been the influence for the Great Gatsby. He had gone from rags to riches when he developed the Mid-Continent oil refinery in Tulsa, and they wanted something even grander than the other two that I just showed you. And so Mizner put together Playa Riente, Laughing Beach. If you read Mizner's memoir, you will find that secretly this is his favorite house. It was so amazing. Have a look at these interiors. That's the foyer here on the right, and these gorgeous painted leather walls, all lost. They don't even know where those leather walls are. Another view of the foyer. I had said that they had gone from rags to riches, which is true, but they went back to rags, not quite to rags, but they lost most of their money, and that magnificent house was bought by Anna Dodge, and she owned it until the end of her life. She and her family tried to get it turned into a club or to a hotel. They were turned down by the town at that point in time, and here's what that magnificent plot was. The only thing left is a staircase here that I'll show you now. This magnificent staircase is left, and this famous tunnel. The tunnel began, way back in the lot, in the property, and don't think of it as a tunnel. It had changing rooms and massage rooms, and it was a beautiful kind of underground house. The Prince of Wales, before he became the Duke of Windsor, used to go there and love swimming there, coming through that tunnel. And then after his marriage to Wallis Simpson, the Windsors would always go and stay at Playa Riente and love to have parties that started in the tunnel, coming out on these steps. And those steps are the only thing that still is left of magnificent Playa Riente. Now, I've given you 3 sad stories. Let's look at a good one. The Warburtons from Philadelphia. They built, and by the way, Harold Gray is probably, it was the subject, the Warburtons, of Daddy Warbucks. And they built wonderful Villa des Cygnes. Villa des Cygnes, which still exists, belonged to the Warburtons until they died within a few months of each other in 1954. And so it was the mid-50s, that's when these other houses were starting to be torn down, and everybody was really pleased when it was bought by Sue Whitmore, who was known as the Listerine Queen. She was a wealthy woman, so it was assumed that she would save it. But that's not exactly what happened. She also owned the home that was immediately adjacent to it. And so this poor house was broken up into 4 different buildings and to 10 apartments. And it was a complete mess until Kathleen McFarlane Ross bought it and turned it into the way it looks in this particular picture now. But it was also needing a great deal of renovation before Nick and Dee Adams bought the house and have gone through an extensive renovation of it, which we see here. One of the problems with most, if not all, of Mizner's buildings is that the foundations were inadequate. They were built on shifting sand. You know, it's a barrier island. The only place where the limestone rock comes close to the surface is where Mrs. Hutton had the brilliance to put Mar-a-Lago. Mar-a-Lago is anchored into limestone rock. The other houses that we discussed were on shifting sands. And as this one also, when the Adams bought it, the first thing that an engineer did was to open up the floors, and they found out that a river was running under it. That right there on the tip of the island, of the tip of Worth Avenue, which is an extended little peninsula, it was about to fall into the water. And a lot of the other major historic homes from the 20s and 30s had that problem. Can you imagine the cost? I mean, project stops, 2 or 3 years elapse, they lift the house, they put down an adequate foundation, they lower the house back onto the foundation. Multi-million dollars and multi-year of work before you can really get into the renovation. But Villa des Cygnes is charming. It's an enchanting little peninsula at the end of Worth Avenue. It has some Venetian elements to it, including this staircase that was, of course, renovated with everything else. And you come up that staircase now, and you see the beautiful house renovated, put back together again, and it's grandeur. It's one of the really happy stories of restoration. Now, Mizner, most architects want to have their own home. So once he was famous and successful and money was pouring in, he built his own home. First one was El Solano. El Solano was bought shortly as he was moving in by Harold Vanderbilt because Mizner went from ups and downs in his financial dealings. He needed the money. He sold it to Harold Vanderbilt. And this magnificent house has had a terrific history. It went from Vanderbilt to the McLean family, the last people to own and wear the Hope Diamond. Brownie McLean is still alive and very active in Palm Beach. And then it went to John Lennon. And John Lennon owned it shortly before he was killed. And in 1979 was the first year that landmarking started in the city of Palm Beach. 20 houses were put up for landmarking. 19 of their owners lawyered up to fight it vigorously, and the only one who didn't was John Lennon. And I think it was because of his support that landmarking became a fact in 79. It would have happened eventually, but not immediately if it hadn't been for that man's support. The second house Mizner builds for himself is Concha Marina, which he sold on the time he was moving in to George Sloan. This house has also had an interesting history because it became Ivana Trump's house after their divorce. Then the third house he builds is Sin Ciudad. And Edward Moore bought it just as he was about to move in. And Edward Moore and Harold Vanderbilt will be the benefactors of Addison Mizner towards the end of his life when he's in financial trouble. Sad story here, very sad story. It was torn down this month, within the last 2 weeks. Why? Why was this fantastic Mizner torn down? There is a ruling on the Landmarks Commission bylaws that if a house has been altered by more than 50%, the owner can apply to unlandmark it. The house was unlandmarked, and it was sold, and it was just recently torn down. Once a house has been unlandmarked, you can't landmark it again. So Mizner, having built 3 houses for himself that he didn't manage to live into, finally decides he's going to build a house that's going to be sufficiently grand for his lifestyle and for the way he entertained his clients, but that probably nobody would want. It wasn't on the Intercoastal. It wasn't on the ocean. It was a 5-story walk-up. It does have a beautiful little pewter-lined elevator, but basically no rolling grasses down to water. He fell in love, and he wanted to have something like he saw in Rome, where you would walk through streets and you'd have no idea that behind a wall there was this palace. And he builds this town palace, a villa, which he called Villa Mizner. By now, as you can see, Worth Avenue, he had started to build all around Worth Avenue. You have the Everglades Club on the right of your screen, and Villa Mizner is this structure here. And so I find the whole story of Villa Mizner so fascinating, and its owners particularly. Addison Mizner was its owner from the time of it when it was built in 1924 until his death in Villa Mizner in 1933. And then Villa Mizner goes through a really dark period with the Depression. Palm Beach suffered greatly during that period of time. It was in various bankruptcy courts for 4 years, possibly torn down, possibly turned into an apartment building. It actually did sort of function as an apartment building during that time, until Rose and Mortimer Sachs left their family business in New York, because Mortimer married this young girl who already had a son and was sort of shunned by the family. And he said, well, we'll just be out of here. And he drives into Palm Beach, and he says, I want to buy some real estate. And the broker said, well, we have a villa and a villa, and the villa is called Villa Mizner and Villa Mizner. And he said, what's a villa? You see, Mizner had decided that he wanted to build little pedestrian streets around, interconnecting with Worth Avenue, from Peruvian Avenue to the north, and also towards the Everglades Club on the south. And so he built these wonderful villas. And I urge you, the next time you are in Palm Beach, if you haven't already, but even if you have, wander through the villas. They have such incredible charm. And so the Saxes come, and they buy the entire villa because Mizner had owned it, and it was in bankruptcy along with the villa. And they lived there. They had a nice long run there until 1985. I took this picture of Rose just before her 100th birthday, and she died at 103 two years ago. But in her own words, she said, when we first moved in there, all of Mizner's things were there. And she said, but I didn't want to live with Mizner. I wanted my own things. And we can understand that. In hindsight from now, it was a shame, of course. And lots of that furniture was dispersed and sold. And some of it is in the museum in Boca Raton. Some of it is in the museums in Palm Beach. And a lot of it has found its way, mercifully, back to the villa over time. But they had a very sort of contemporary look for the period of time. And when she sold it, it went into bankruptcy again, not because she was bankrupt, but because the first buyer after her went bankrupt. And it went through all sorts of vicissitudes until this couple bought it, Robert and Gay Knuth. She had been Miss Norway, stunning, stunning woman. She still is, by the way, very interesting lady. But she, too, wanted her own mark on it. And so she had a very 80s look. And everything was going well. And by the way, none of the Villa Mizner owners were members of the Everglades Club, which is just across the street. So the Knuths seemed respectable enough for the membership, the committee of the membership at Everglades Club. And their application was being considered until the time that Mr. Knuth came back from Norway, where they had a summer home, and caught Mrs. Knuth in bed with the ironmonger who was replacing some of the ironwork, and threw all of her clothes out of the window onto Worth Avenue, right in front of the Everglades Club, which isn't exactly what the commission was looking for in their new members. So they, too, never became members of the Everglades Club. And then finally, it falls into the hands of Nick and Dee Adams in 2003. And the Adams are great historian preservationists. And they were determined to bring Villa Mizner, as they did with Villa des Cygnes, back into its normal glory, natural earlier glory. This is the living room when Addison Mizner lived in it, and now this is the living room as the Adams have it together. And you can see these pictures side by side. The dining room when Addison Mizner had it, and the dining room as it is now, and with those two pictures side by side. I thought the story was so fascinating. When I was a little boy, I was telling a couple of the people who walked in tonight, they said, where does your interest in these houses begin? When I was a little boy, my mother lived in Palm Beach, and we lived in Switzerland, as you so kindly said in your beautiful introduction. So when I would visit my mother as a little boy, she would say, we're going to go to lunch at Mrs. So-and-so's house, and you'll eat in the kitchen, which was fine because I had a lot more fun in the kitchen. But I've arranged for the architect or the house manager or someone to show you around the house and to give you instructions and information on the house. And tonight we're going to have a quiz at dinner. And it became a game. The history of these houses became a game with me when I was about this tall. And I had always wanted to write about a great Mizner house. And so when I retired, I started to search around for one, and then finally, one day, Nick Adams called me up, and because I really felt I needed the cooperation of the current owner. And Nick Adams called me up, and he said, please, my wife and I would like to see you, please come over. He opened a magnificent bottle of wine, and we sat up on the terrace and had a drink. And he started off, he has a great sense of humor. He started off by saying, we know you want to write a book about this house or any Mizner house. And he said, we would never let anybody in that we know write about personal details about our family. I thought, why am I here? And then a long pause, and he said, except you. So charmingly, this book was written, and it talks about the house as well as the villas that are around the house. We see here the front door of Villa Mizner. In Mizner's era, that was a passageway through to a different section of the villa that was closed in later on by an interim owner when he made the condominiums out of the whole villa and created this front door instead of an open passageway. I'll give you a little trip from Via Parigi, which is just to the west of Via Mizner, and we'll walk through Via Parigi, which is owned by the Everglades Club, and come around into Via Mizner. Now, we didn't clear it out. Palm Beach is a very well-kept secret. There are very few people in Palm Beach. In season, many of the residents will complain about the fact that they have to ride around the block once to find a parking space right in front of the store they want to drop in. It is not overcrowded by any stretch of the imagination. And we just one day decided to take this little video walking through Via Parigi over towards Renato's restaurant is there in the background. So Villa Mizner is a 5-story building that sits upon a 2-story base. You have here the main floor. This is the living room of which you've seen pictures. And then you have 2 floors of 2 bedrooms and 2 baths each. And the top floor, which is called the Mirador, the viewing room, which was the highest point in Palm Beach, where Mizner used to love to sit and work and sleep often. And he died up there, looking over Palm Beach, which really one could say he was responsible for creating. Right next to Villa Mizner, to the east, they bought that building too. And it was Mizner Industries offices. On the bottom floor, they made pottery and furniture and sold it there. And then on this next floor up, Singer and Mizner had grand offices. Then above that, the architects and the draftsmen worked. And you would think that with this enormous success of Mizner Industries and Mizner Architects, he basically had a monopoly. Had a complete monopoly of all of the functions of an architect carrying a project through to completion. You would think that he might have started to rest on his laurels, but they decided no. The success of the villas, they wanted to build an entire city in that style, in the Venetian style. So they went up and down the Intercoastal, searching for an area that looked topographically very much like Palm Beach and West Palm Beach. And they came across this unincorporated area called Boca Raton at the time. And you see the Intercoastal opening up into a lake here, like Lake Worth, where Palm Beach is. This would be the equivalent of West Palm Beach, of course, and this would be the equivalent of Palm Beach. And they bought it, and they set out to design this incredible town, as I said, in the Venetian style. It was to have a moat. It was to have a deep harbor where Mrs. Post could get Sea Cloud into because she couldn't get it into Lake Worth. and it was going to just be, they started to run completely crazy at the very, very height of the building boom and the banking boom. It was the most ill-timed effort you can possibly imagine. Mizner was going to build his castle out into Lake Boca Raton, which was going to have a moat to be connected to right where the Boca Raton Hotel and Club is now. That, by the way, was called the Cloister Inn, and it was supposed to be the smaller of the two hotels they were going to build. We see here the Cloister Inn as it was completed in 1926 with its magnificent cloisters. The proportions are fabulous when you look at the proportions of these pillars, these columns. That initial piece was fantastic. We see here the opening with some of his actor friends, some of the Kiss of the Ages here. You know, I don't know what he beat that up with, but he beat that up with something. The magnificent dining room of the Cloister Inn, which was called the Cathedral Room, and up until recently still looked pretty well, but they just haven't cared for the preservation that much. These magnificent gold leaf columns have recently all been painted over. So the original, and this parapet wasn't there. I don't know why they stuck it on. Mizner didn't like parapets. So this was the original hotel without this entranceway. And of course, what has become this enormous compound of the Boca Raton Resort and Club. As I had mentioned, it was supposed to be the smaller of the hotel. The Ritz-Carlton Hotel was going to be over on what is A1A across the lake. And it was never built because right at the time, as I said, it was the worst timing possible. The real estate bubble burst in 26, and the Mizner Development Corporation started in 25. It was followed by a series of other blows. The Miami hurricane, 475 people dead, followed immediately by the banking collapse of 1927. This cartoon is so funny, isn't it? And then immediately in 1928, the Okeechobee hurricane, 4,000 people killed in the Okeechobee. And the interesting thing is that none of Mizner's homes were destroyed or even seriously damaged. A few tiles off of roofs. They were built in a way that these great hurricanes didn't bother them, didn't destroy them. And then, of course, the Great Depression of 1929. But Mizner and Singer had put together a board of directors which was formidable for the Boca Raton Mizner Development Corporation. Senator DuPont was on the board. Harold Vanderbilt was on the board. His brother, William Keshem Vanderbilt, on the board. The chairman was the big developer from the Philadelphia area, Clarence Geist. And then to round it off with some sophistication and fame, they had Irving Berlin, the Duchess of Sutherland also joined the board, and finally Elizabeth Arden was also on the board. Now you would have thought that this incredible, powerful board of directors could have kept the Mizner Development Corporation afloat. And of course it had the means to do so. But Wilson was going nuts with very grandiose statements. These are some of the lesser of the grandiose statements, that it was going to be the biggest resort in the world, that pretty soon only the employees of the families that lived in Boca Raton were going to be housed in Palm Beach, that it was going to be a cosmopolitan world community where every single building in it had to be designed by Addison Mizner. And so they called Mizner in and they said, you have to fire Wilson, who was the chief financial officer, by the way, of the Mizner Development Corporation. Some attorneys had started to tell them that they were going to end up personally liable if Wilson kept shooting his mouth off with some of his amazing statements. And initially, Mizner said yes, he would get rid of Wilson, but he didn't. So what did they do? They got rid of both of them. And they were fired on April 30th of 1927. That very night, Mizner was walking up and down Worth Avenue in Palm Beach crying. And when somebody asked him why he was crying, he said it was because Johnny Brown had died that day. He was much more upset about having lost his spider monkey pet, who had been on his shoulder for many, many years, than he was with being fired in the bankruptcy of the Boca Raton Development Corporation. By the way, this is the only approved cemetery in Palm Beach. There are two tombstones there. Laddie, who was Rose Sachs's collie, and Johnny Brown are both buried right at the foot of Villa Mizner by a charming restaurant called Pizza al Fresco, which is right in Via Mizner. I urge you to all go there if some of you already haven't. Reasonably priced, charming. You're looking at all of this fabulous original architecture. But we all know what eventually Boca Raton became. But when Mizner was fired, he had very little work left, initially a few commissions, very little work and no money. If it hadn't been for Harold Vanderbilt, he wouldn't have designed this wonderful fountain, the Mizner Memorial Fountain in the center of Palm Beach, just to the north of our fantastic town hall. It was in ruins up until a few years ago, and it's been beautifully restored now. I urge you to go and see it by day or by night. It's really quite charming. So in 1932, Mizner had had several heart attacks, and he decided that he was going to go to California to see his brother Wilson. He wanted to spend his 60th birthday with Wilson. With some of the last monies that he had set Wilson up in California and bought him a share in the Brown Derby. So in a very primitive car, because his Stutz had been repossessed, all of his automobiles had been repossessed, and in a primitive car, he sets out with a dog, a bird, and he goes on his way to California. Can you imagine? He was sick, he had had some heart attacks, his leg was acting up, and driving in those conditions and that kind of car and those kind of roads in those days. But he gets to the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles to see Wilson, where he had also set him up in an apartment. And on arrival, he collapses. He's taken to the hospital. He's had another heart attack. And he comes out of the hospital. And for a period of several weeks, he and Wilson would have dinner every night at the Brown Derby, where they had invented one-way glass so that they could watch all of the people walking by. And when they saw a bill collector coming down the street, they would go run and hide in the bathroom. And when they would catch them, Wilson would say, "Oh, I'm served with this thing." He said, "You can put it on that pile. I don't much mind if it's on the top or the bottom or the middle. We're never going to be able to get to it. And you can put those bills over here on this pile." And so they continued to be rogues even in this amazing period. So Mizner says to his brother, "Let's go take the waters in Mineral Springs in Texas on our way back to Palm Beach." And Mizner says, Wilson said, "No, I'm working on a really big deal. I can't possibly leave right now." And so Mizner leaves alone. He collapses again when he gets to Mineral Springs. They don't give him the baths and the water, of course. And somehow he manages to get back to his famous, wonderful Villa Mizner. And he's brought up and stays his last few days in his Mirador here, which was just like that. And on the 5th of February of 33, he asked his wonderful, charming housekeeper, who remained faithful to him, Medina. He said, "Please prop me up so that I can see the sun setting over West Palm Beach." And right at sunset, he passed away with his new monkey, Deuteronomy Brown, and a couple of pug dogs next to him. And by all accounts from Medina and his last secretary, his last employee, Miss Calloway, in his last days, he was very happy. He was very serene. We may think it was a terrible, sad end to a man who had such a great life and such a meteoric rise to fame late in his life, but he was very cavalier and happy-go-lucky about it. And so on February 9th, he passed away, as I said, at sunset. And he had asked a couple of things in a will. He was intestate, but he had jotted down a few notes just before he died. He didn't want to have any kind of service. That was not respected. Mrs. Stotesbury invited over 1,000 people to come through Villa Mizner, which they did. She came into the foyer here, which is just as it is now. During the grand day, he would have a string quartet playing there every evening, and it was open house. And his clients could wander in. "Oh, come on over. We'll cross over the bridge and look at some of the drawings that I've done for you." They'd have drinks sitting around in the living room. Irving Berlin would be playing on the piano over there. On occasion, Isadora Duncan would be dancing around. It was the most incredible scene of happiness and gaiety in there. And Eva Stotbury came by just to make sure that it had been set up the way she had asked it to be. She swore that she looked out onto the terrace, because there's a magnificent terrace out these doors, and had seen Deuteronomy Brown playing with the ghost of Johnny Brown. And everybody who has subsequently owned Villa Mizner will swear that there's a happy ghost of Johnny Brown in that house. The other thing that was in his will was that he was to be buried in an unmarked grave in San Mateo, California, in an urn, one of the urns that had been made in Mizner Industries. But you see two urns, because when Wilson heard about this a week later, he died. And they are buried side by side in unmarked graves in San Mateo. But we owe what became the Palm Beach look and ultimately the South Florida look to this great man who was such a romantic and such an amazing figure. Worth Avenue is just one example of his genius. And with that, I want to thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very generous. Marvelously generous. Thank you. Thank you so much.